The 8th day. Friday, 10 December. HMS Invincible. Ryan awoke in the dark. The curtains were drawn in the cabin's 2 small portholes. He shook his head a few times to clear it and began to assess what was going on around him. The Invincible was moving on the seas, but not as much as before. He got up to look out of a porthole and saw the last red glow of sunset aft under scudding clouds. He checked his watch and did some clumsy mental arithmetic, concluding that it was 6 in the evening, local time. That translated to about 6 hours of sleep. He felt pretty good, considering. A minor headache from the brandy, so much for the theory that good stuff doesn't give you a hangover, and his muscles were stiff. He did a few sit-ups to work out the knots. There was a small bathroom, he corrected himself, adjoining the cabin. Ryan splashed some water on his face and washed his mouth out, not wanting to look in the mirror. He decided he had to. Counterfeit or not, he was wearing his country's uniform, and he had to look presentable. It took a minute to get his hair in place and the uniform arranged properly. The CIA had done a nice job of tailoring, given such short notice. Finished, he went out the door towards the flag bridge. "Feeling better, Jack?" Admiral White pointed him to a tray full of cups. It was only tea, but it was a start. "Thank you, Admiral. Those few hours really helped. I guess I'm in time for dinner?" "Breakfast!" White corrected him with a laugh. "What? Pardon me, Admiral?" Ryan shook his head again. He was still a little groggy. "That's a sunrise, Commander. Changing orders. We're heading west again. Kennedy's moving east at high speed, and we're to take station inshore." "Who said, sir?" "Sinkland. I gather Joshua was not at all pleased. You are to remain with us for the moment, and under the circumstances it seemed the reasonable thing to let you sleep. You did appear to need it." Must have been 18 hours, Ryan thought. No wonder he felt stiff. "You do look much better," Admiral White noted from his leather swivel chair. He got up, took Ryan's arm, and guided him aft. "Now, for breakfast. I've been waiting for you. Captain Hunter will brief you on our revised orders. Weather's clearing up for a few days, they tell me. Escort assignments are being reshuffled. We're to operate in conjunction with your New Jersey group. Our anti-submarine operations begin in earnest in another 12 hours. It's a good thing you got that extra sleep, lad. You'll bloody need it." Ryan ran his hand over his face. "Can I shave, sir?" "We still permit beards. Let it wait until after breakfast." Flag quarters on HMS Invincible were not quite up to the standard of those on the Kennedy, but close. White had a private dining area. A steward in a white livery served them expertly, setting a third place for Hunter, who appeared within a few minutes. When they started talking, the steward was excused. "We rendezvous with a pair of your Knox-class frigates in 2 hours. We already have them on radar. 2 more 1052s, plus an oiler and 2 Perrys will join us in another 36 hours. They were on their way home from the Med. With our own escorts, a total of 9 warships. A noteworthy collection, I think. We'll be working 500 miles offshore, with the New Jersey Tarawa force 200 miles to our west." "Tarawa? What do we need a regiment of Marines for?" Ryan asked. Hunter explained briefly. "Not a bad idea, that. The funny thing is, with Kennedy racing for the Azores, that rather leaves us guarding the American coast." Hunter grinned. "This may be the first time the Royal Navy has ever done that." "Certainly, since it belonged to us." "What are we up against?" "The first of the Alphas will be on your coast tonight, 4 of them ahead of all the others. The Soviet surface force passed Iceland last night. It's divided into 3 groups. One is built around their carrier Kiev, 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. The second, probably the Force flag, is built around Kirov, with 3 additional cruisers and 6 destroyers, and the third is centered on Moskva, 3 more cruisers and 7 destroyers. I gather that the Soviets will want to use the Kiev and the Moskva groups inshore, with Kirov guarding them out to sea. But Kennedy's relocation will make them rethink that. Regardless, the total force carries a considerable number of surface-to-surface missiles, and potentially we are very exposed. To help out with that, your Air Force has an E-3 Sentry detailed to arrive here in an hour to exercise with our Harriers, and when we get farther west, we'll have additional land-based air support. On the whole, our position is hardly an enviable one, but Ivan's is rather less so. So far as the question of finding Red October is concerned," Hunter shrugged, "how we conduct our search will depend on how Ivan deploys. At the moment we're conducting some tracking drills. The lead Alpha is 80 miles northwest of us, steaming at 40-plus knots, and we have a helicopter in pursuit, which is roughly what it amounts to." The fleet operations officer concluded. "Will you join us below?" "Admiral," Ryan wanted to see Invincible's Combat Information Center. "Certainly." 30 minutes later, Ryan was in a darkened, quiet room whose walls were a solid bank of electronic instruments and glass plotting panels. The Atlantic Ocean was full of Russian submarines. The White House. The Soviet ambassador entered the Oval Office a minute early at 10:59 a.m. He was a short, overweight man with a broad Slavic face and eyes that would have done a professional gambler proud. They revealed nothing. He was a career diplomat, having served in a number of posts throughout the Western world, and a 30-year member of the Communist Party's Foreign Department. "Good morning, Mr. President, Dr. Pelt." Alexei Arbatov nodded politely to both men. The president, he noted at once, was seated behind his desk. Every other time he'd been here, the president had come around the desk to shake hands, then sat down beside him. "Help yourself to some coffee, Mr. Ambassador," Pelt offered. The special assistant to the president for national security affairs was well known to Arbatov. Jeffrey Pelt was an academic from the Georgetown University's Center for Strategic and International Studies, an enemy, but a well-mannered Kulturny enemy. Arbatov had a fondness for the niceties of formal behavior. Today, Pelt was standing at his boss's side, unwilling to come too close to the Russian bear. Arbatov did not get himself any coffee. "Mr. Ambassador," Pelt began, "we have noted a troubling increase in Soviet naval activity in the North Atlantic." "Oh?" Arbatov's eyebrows shot up in a display of surprise that fooled no one, and he knew it. "I have no knowledge of this. As you know, I have never been a sailor." "Shall we dispense with the bullshit, Mr. Ambassador?" the president said. Arbatov did not permit himself to be surprised by the vulgarity. It made the American president seem very Russian, and like Soviet officials he seemed to need a professional like Pelt around to smooth the edges. "You currently have nearly 100 naval vessels operating in the North Atlantic or heading in that direction. Chairman Narmonov and my predecessor agreed years ago that no such operation would take place without prior notification. The purpose of this agreement, as you know, was to prevent acts that might appear to be unduly provocative to one side or the other. This agreement has been kept until now. Now, my military advisers tell me that what is going on looks very much like a war exercise, indeed, could be the precursor to a war. How are we to tell the difference? Your ships are now passing east of Iceland and will soon be in a position from which they can threaten our trade routes to Europe. This situation is at the least unsettling, and at the most a grave and wholly unwarranted provocation. The scope of this action has not yet been made public. That will change, and when it does, Alex, the American people will demand action on my part." The president paused, expecting a response, but getting only a nod. Pelt went on for him. "Mr. Ambassador, your country has seen fit to cast aside an agreement which for years has been a model of East-West cooperation. How can you expect us to regard this as anything other than a provocation?" "Mr. President, Dr. Pelt, truly, I have no knowledge of this." Arbatov lied with the utmost sincerity. "I will contact Moscow at once to ascertain the facts. Is there any message you wish me to pass along?" "Yes. As you and your superiors in Moscow will understand," the president said, "we will deploy our ships and aircraft to observe yours. Prudence requires this. We have no wish to interfere with whatever legitimate operations your forces may be engaged in. It is not our intention to make a provocation of our own, but, under the terms of our agreement, we have the right to know what is going on, Mr. Ambassador. Until we do, we are unable to issue the proper orders to our men. It would be well for your government to consider that having so many of your ships and our ships, your aircraft and our aircraft in close proximity, is an inherently dangerous situation. Accidents can happen. An action by one side or the other which at another time would seem harmless might seem to be something else entirely. Wars have begun in this way, Mr. Ambassador." The president leaned back to let that thought hang in the air for a moment. When he went on, he spoke more gently. "Of course I regard this possibility as remote, but is it not irresponsible to take such chances? Mr. President, you make your point well, as always. But as you know, the sea is free for the passage of all, and—" "Mr. Ambassador," Pelt interrupted. "Consider a simple analogy. Your next-door neighbor begins to patrol his front yard with a loaded shotgun while your children are at play in your own front yard. In this country such action would be technically legal. Even so, would it not be a matter of concern?" "So it would, Dr. Pelt, but the situation you describe is very different." Now the President interrupted. "Indeed it is. The situation at hand is far more dangerous. It is the breach of an agreement, and I find that especially disquieting. I had hoped that we were entering a new era of Soviet-American relations. We have settled our trade differences. We have just concluded a new grain agreement. You had a major part in that. We have been moving forward, Mr. Ambassador. Is this at an end?" The President shook his head emphatically. "I hope not. But the choice is yours. The relationship between our countries can only be based on trust. Mr. Ambassador, I trust that I have not alarmed you. As you know, it is my habit to speak plainly. I personally dislike the greasy dissimulation of diplomacy. At times like this we must communicate quickly and clearly. We have a dangerous situation before us, and we must work together rapidly to resolve it. My military commanders are greatly concerned, and I need to know today what your naval forces are up to. I expect a reply by 7 this evening. Failing that, I will be on the direct line to Moscow to demand one." Arbatov stood. "Mr. President, I will transmit your message within the hour. Please keep in mind, however, the time differential between Washington and Moscow. I know that a weekend has just begun, and that the Soviet Union is a worker's paradise, but I expect that some of your country's managers may still be at work. In any case, I will detain you no further. Good day." Pelt led Arbatov out, then came back and sat down. "Maybe I was just a little tough on him," the President said. "Yes, sir." Pelt thought that he had been too damned tough. He had little affection for the Russians, but he too liked the niceties of diplomatic exchange. "I think we can say that you succeeded in getting your message across." "He knows." "He knows, but he doesn't know we know." "We think," the President grimaced. "What a crazy goddamn game this is. And to think I had a nice, safe career going for me, putting mafiosi in jail. Do you think he'll snap at the bait I offered?" "Legitimate operations? Did you see his hands twitch at that? He'll go after it like a marlin after a squid." Pelt walked over to pour himself half a cup of coffee. It pleased him that the China service was gold-trimmed. "I wonder what they'll call it. Legitimate operations. Probably a rescue mission. If they call it a fleet exercise, they admit to violating the notification protocol. A rescue operation justifies the level of activity, the speed with which it was laid on, and the lack of publicity. Their press never reports this sort of thing. As a guess, I'd say they'll call it a rescue. Say a submarine is missing. Maybe even to the point of calling it a missile sub." "No, they won't go that far. We also have that agreement about keeping our missile subs 500 miles offshore. Arbatov probably has his instructions on what to tell us already, but he'll play for all the time he can. It's also vaguely possible that he's in the dark. We know how they compartmentalize information. You suppose we're reading too much into his talent for obfuscation?" "I think not, sir. It is a principle of diplomacy," Pelt observed, "that one must know something of the truth in order to lie convincingly." The President smiled. "Well, they've had enough time to play this game. I hope my belated reaction will not disappoint them." "No, sir. Alex must have half expected you to kick him out the door." "The thought's occurred to me more than once. His diplomatic charm has always been lost on me. That's the one thing about the Russians. They remind me so much of the mafia chieftains I used to prosecute. The same smattering of culture and good manners, and the same absence of morality." The President shook his head. He was talking like a hawk again. "Stay close, Jeff. I have George Farmer coming in here in a few minutes, but I want you around when our friend comes back." Pelt walked back to his office, pondering the President's remark. It was, he admitted to himself, crudely accurate. The most wounding insult to an educated Russian was to be called nekulturny, uncultured. The term didn't translate adequately, yet the same men who sat in the gilt boxes at the Moscow State Opera, weeping at the end of a performance of Boris Godunov, would immediately turn around and order the execution or imprisonment of 100 men without blinking. A strange people, made more strange by their political philosophy. But the President had too many sharp edges, and Pelt wished he'd learned to soften them. A speech in front of the American Legion was one thing. A discussion with the ambassador of a foreign power was something else. CIA Headquarters. "Cardinal's in trouble, Judge," Ritter sat down.
No surprise there.
Moore removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Something Ryan had not seen was the cover note from the station chief in Moscow saying that to get his latest signal out, Cardinal had bypassed half the courier chain that ran from the Kremlin to the U.S. Embassy. The agent was getting bold in his old age.
What does the station chief say exactly?
Cardinal's supposed to be in the hospital with pneumonia. Maybe it's true, but...
He's getting old, and it is winter over there. But who believes in coincidences?
Moore looked down at his desk.
What do you suppose they'd do if they've turned him?
He'd die quietly. Depends on who turned him. If it was the KGB, they might want to make something of it, especially since our friend Andropov took a lot of their prestige with him when he left. But I don't think so. Given who his sponsor is, it would raise too much of a ruckus. Same thing if the GRU turns him. No, they'd grill him for a few weeks, then quietly do away with him. A public trial would be too counterproductive. Judge Moore frowned. They sounded like doctors discussing a terminally ill patient. He didn't even know what Cardinal looked like. There was a photograph somewhere in the file, but he had never seen it. It was easier that way. As an appellate court judge, he had never had to look a defendant in the eye. He'd just review the law in a detached way. He tried to keep his stewardship of the CIA the same way. Moore knew that this might be perceived as cowardly, and was very different from what people expect of a DCI, but even spies got old, and old men developed consciences and doubts that rarely troubled the young. It was time to leave the company. Nearly 3 years. It was enough. He'd accomplished what he was supposed to do.
Tell the station chief to lay off. No inquiries of any kind directed at Cardinal. If he's really sick, we'll be hearing from him again. If not, we'll know that soon enough, too.
Right. Ritter had succeeded in confirming Cardinal's report. One agent had reported that the fleet was sailing with additional political officers. Another that the surface force was commanded by an academic sailor and crony of Gorshkov, who had flown to Severomorsk and boarded the Kirov minutes before the fleet had sailed. The naval architect who was believed to have designed the Red October was supposed to have gone with him. A British agent had reported that detonators from the various weapons carried by the surface ships had been hastily taken aboard from their usual storage depots ashore. Finally, there was an unconfirmed report that Admiral Koroff, commander of the Northern Fleet, was not at his command post. His whereabouts were unknown. Together, the information was enough to confirm the Willow report, and more was still coming in. The U.S. Naval Academy.
Skip?
Oh, howdy, Admiral. Will you join me? Tyler waved to a vacant chair across the table. I got a message from the Pentagon for you. The superintendent of the Naval Academy, a former submarine officer, sat down. You have an appointment tonight at 19:30 hours. That's all he said. Great! Tyler was just finishing his lunch. He'd been working on the simulation program nearly around the clock since Monday. The appointment meant that he would have access to the Air Force's Cray 2 tonight. His program was just about ready. What's this all about, anyway? Sorry, sir, I can't say. You know how it is. The White House. The Soviet ambassador was back at 4 in the afternoon. To avoid press notice, he had been taken into the Treasury building across the street from the White House and brought through a connecting tunnel which few knew existed. The president hoped that he had found this unsettling. Pelt hustled in to be there when Arbatov arrived. Mr. President, Arbatov reported, standing at attention. The president had not known that he had any military experience. I am instructed to convey to you the regrets of my government that there has not been time to inform you of this. One of our nuclear submarines is missing and presumed lost. We are conducting an emergency rescue operation. The president nodded soberly, motioning the ambassador to a chair. Pelt sat next to him. This is somewhat embarrassing, Mr. President. You see, in our Navy, as in yours, duty on a nuclear submarine is a posting of the greatest importance, and consequently those selected for it are among our best educated and trusted men. In this particular case, several members of the crew, the officers that is, are sons of high party officials. One is even a son of a Central Committee member. I cannot say which, of course. The Soviet Navy's great effort to find her sons is understandable, though, I admit, a bit undisciplined. Arbatov feigned embarrassment beautifully, speaking as though he were confiding a great family secret. Therefore, this has developed into what your people call an all-hands operation. As you undoubtedly know, it was undertaken virtually overnight. I see, the president said sympathetically.
That makes me feel a little better, Alex. Jeff, I think it's late enough in the day. How about you fix us all a drink? Bourbon, Alex?
Yes, thank you, sir. Pelt walked over to a rosewood cabinet against the wall. The ornate antique contained a small bar, complete with an ice bucket which was stocked every afternoon. The president often liked to have a drink or two before dinner, something else that reminded Arbutoff of his countrymen. Dr. Pelt had had ample experience playing presidential bartender. In a few minutes he came back with 3 glasses in his hands. "To tell you the truth, we rather suspected this was a rescue operation," Pelt said.
"I don't know how we get our young men to do this sort of work." The president sipped at his drink. Arbutoff worked hard on his. He had said frequently at local cocktail parties that he preferred American bourbon to his native vodka. Maybe it was true.
"We've lost a pair of nuclear boats, I believe. How many does this make for you? 3? 4?
"I don't know, Mr. President. I expect your information on this is better than my own." The president noted that he had just told the truth for the first time today.
"Certainly, I can agree with you that such duty is both dangerous and demanding." "How many men aboard, Alex?" the president asked.
"I have no idea. 100, more or less, I suppose. I've never been aboard a naval vessel."
"Mostly kids, probably, just like our crews. It is indeed a sad commentary on both our countries that our mutual suspicions must condemn so many of our best young men to such hazards, when we know that some won't be coming back. But how can it be otherwise?"
The president paused, turning to look out the windows. The snow was melting on the south lawn. It was time for his next line. "Perhaps we can help," the president offered speculatively. "Yes, perhaps we can use this tragedy as an opportunity to reduce those suspicions by some small amount. Perhaps we can make something good come from this to demonstrate that our relations really have improved." Pelt turned away, fumbling for his pipe. In their many years of friendship he could never understand how the president got away with so much. Pelt had met him at Washington University when he was majoring in political science, the president in pre-law. Back then the chief executive had been president of the Dramatic Society. Certainly amateur theatrics had helped his legal career. It was said that at least one mafia don had been sent up the river by sheer rhetoric. The president referred to it as his sincere act. "Mr. Ambassador, I offer you the assistance and the resources of the United States in the search for your missing countrymen."
"That is most kind of you, Mr. President, but—"
The president held up his hand. "No buts, Alex. If we cannot cooperate in something like this, how can we hope to cooperate in more serious matters? If memory serves, last year, when one of our Navy patrol aircraft crashed off the Aleutians, one of your fishing vessels, it had been an intelligence trawler, picked up the crew, saved their lives. Alex, we owe you a debt for that, a debt of honor, and the United States will not be said to be ungrateful." He paused for effect. "They're probably all dead, you know. I don't suppose there's more chance of surviving a sub-accident than of surviving a plane crash, but at least the crew's families will know. Jeff, don't we have some specialized submarine rescue equipment?" "With all the money we give the Navy? We damn well ought to. I'll call Foster about it." "Good," the president said. "Alex, it is too much to expect that our mutual suspicions will be allayed by something so small as this. Your history and ours conspire against us. But let's make a small beginning with this. If we can shake hands in space or over a conference table in Vienna, maybe we can do it here also. I will give the necessary instructions to my commanders as soon as we're finished here." "Thank you, Mr. President." Arbutoff concealed his uneasiness. "And please, convey my respects to Chairman Narmanoff, and my sympathy for the families of your missing men. I appreciate his effort and yours in getting this information to us." "Yes, Mr. President." Arbutoff rose. He left after shaking hands. What were the Americans really up to? He'd warned Moscow. Call it a rescue mission and they'd demand to help. It was their stupid Christmas season, and Americans were addicted to happy endings. It was madness not to call it something else. To hell with the protocol. At the same time, he was forced to admire the American president. A strange man, very open yet full of guile. A friendly man most of the time, yet always ready to seize the advantage. He remembered stories his grandmother had told about how gypsies switched babies. The American president was very Russian. "Well," the president said after the doors closed, "now we can keep a nice close eye on them, and they can't complain. They're lying, and we know it, but they don't know we know. And we're lying, and they certainly suspect it, but not why we're lying. God,
and I told him this morning that not knowing was dangerous. Jeff, I've been thinking about this. I do not like the fact that so much of their Navy is operating off our coast. Ryan was right. The Atlantic is our ocean. I want the Air Force and the Navy to cover them like a goddamn blanket. That's our ocean, and I damn well want them to know it. The President finished off his drink. On the question of the sub, I want our people to have a good look at it, and whoever of the crew wants to defect, we take care of. Quietly, of course.
Of course. As a practical matter, having the officers is as great a coup as having the submarine.
But the Navy will still want to keep it.
I just don't see how we can do that. Not without eliminating the crewmen, and we can't do that.
Agreed.
The President buzzed his secretary.
Get me General Hilton.
The Pentagon. The Air Force's computer center was in a sub-basement of the Pentagon. The room temperature was well below 70 degrees. It was enough to make Tyler's leg ache where it met the metal plastic prosthesis. He was used to that. Tyler was sitting at a control console. He had just finished a trial run of his program named Moray, after the vicious eel that inhabits oceanic reefs. Skip Tyler was proud of his programming ability. He'd taken the old dinosaur program from the files of the Taylor Lab, adapted it to the Common Defense Department computer language, ADA, named for Lady Ada Lovelace, daughter of Lord Byron, and then tightened it up. For most people, this would have been a month's work. He'd done it in 4 days, working almost around the clock, not only because the money was an attractive incentive, but also because the project was a professional challenge. He ended the job quietly satisfied that he could still meet an impossible deadline with time to spare. It was 8 in the evening. Moray had just run through a one-variable value test and not crashed. He was ready. He'd never seen the Cray 2 before, except in photographs, and he was pleased to have a chance to use it. The 2 was 5 units of raw electrical power, each one roughly pentagonal in shape, about 6 feet high and 4 across. The largest unit was the mainframe processor bank. The other 4 were memory banks, arrayed around it in a cruciform configuration. Tyler typed in the command to load his variable sets. For each of the Red October's main dimensions, length, beam, height, he input 10 discrete numerical values. Then came 6 subtly different values for her hull form, block, and prismatic coefficients. There were 5 sets of tunnel dimensions. This aggregated to over 30,000 possible permutations. Next, he keyed in 18 power variables to cover the range of possible engine systems. The Cray 2 absorbed this information and placed each number in its proper slot. It was ready to run. "Okay," he announced to the system operator, an Air Force Master Sergeant. "Raj." The sergeant typed XQT into his terminal. The Cray 2 went to work. Tyler walked over to the sergeant's console. "That's a right lengthy program you've input, sir." The sergeant laid a $10 bill on top of the console. "Betcha my baby can run it in 10 minutes. "Not a chance." Tyler laid his own bill next to the sergeant's. 15 minutes easy. "Split the difference." "All right. Where's the head around here?" "Out the door, sir. Turn right, go down the hall, and it's on the left." Tyler moved towards the door. It annoyed him that he could not walk gracefully. But after 4 years, the inconvenience was a minor one. He was alive. That's what counted. The accident had occurred on a cold, clear night in Groton, Connecticut, only a block from the shipyard's main gate. On Friday, at 3 in the morning, he was driving home after a 20-hour day getting his new command ready for sea. The civilian yard worker had had a long day also, stopping off at a favorite watering hole for a few too many, as the police established afterwards. He got into his car, started it, and ran a red light, ramming Tyler's Pontiac broadside at 50 miles per hour. For him, the accident was fatal. Skip was luckier. It was at an intersection, and he had the green light. When he saw the front end of the Ford not a foot from his left side door, it was far too late. He did not remember going through a pawn shop window, and the next week, when he hovered near death at the Yale New Haven Hospital, was a complete blank. His most vivid memory was of waking up 8 days later, he was to learn, to see his wife Jean holding his hand. His marriage up to that point had been a troubled one, not an uncommon problem for nuclear submarine officers. His first sight of her was not a complimentary one. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hair was tousled, but she had never looked quite so good. He had never appreciated just how important she was. A lot more important than half a leg. "Skip! Skip Tyler!" The former submariner turned awkwardly to see a naval officer running towards him. "Johnny Coleman, how the hell are you?" It was Captain Coleman now, Tyler noted. They had served together twice, a year on the Tecumseh, another on the Shark. Coleman, a weapons expert, had commanded a pair of nuclear subs. "How's the family, Skip?" "Jean's fine. 5 kids now and another on the way." "Damn!" They shook hands with enthusiasm.
You always were a randy bugger. I hear you're teaching at Annapolis.
Yeah, and a little engineering stuff on the side.
What are you doing here?
I'm running a program on the Air Force computer, checking a new ship configuration for Sea Systems Command. It was an accurate enough cover story. What they have you doing?
Op-02's office. I'm Chief of Staff for Admiral Dodge.
Indeed! Tyler was impressed. Vice Admiral Sam Dodge was the current Op-02. The Office of the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Submarine Warfare had administrative control of all aspects of submarine operations. Keeping you busy?
You know it. The crap's really hit the fan.
What do you mean? Tyler hadn't seen the news or read a paper since Monday.
You kidding?
I've been working on this computer program 20 hours a day since Monday, and I don't get ops dispatches anymore. Tyler frowned. He had heard something the other day at the academy, but not paid any attention to it. He was the sort who could focus his whole mind on a single problem. Coleman looked up and down the corridor. It was late on a Friday evening, and they had it entirely to themselves.
Guess I can tell you.
Our Russian friends have some sort of major exercise laid on. Their whole northern fleet's at sea, or damn near. They have subs all over the place.
Doing what?
We're not sure. Looks like they might have a major search and rescue operation. The question is, after what? They have 4 Alphas doing a max speed run for our coast right now, with a gaggle of Victors and Charlies charging in behind them. At first we were worried that they wanted to block the trade routes, but they blitzed right past those. They're definitely heading for our coast, and whatever they're up to, we're getting tons of information. What do they have moving? Tyler asked. 58 nuclear subs and 30 or so surface ships. God, Sinclair must be going ape. You know it, Skip. The fleet's at sea, all of it. Every nuke we have is scrambling for a redeployment. Every P-3 Lockheed ever made is either over the Atlantic or heading that way. Coleman paused. You're still cleared, right?
Sure, for the work I do for the Crystal City gang.
I had a piece of the evaluation of the new Kirov.
I thought that sounded like your work. You always were a pretty good engineer.
You know, the old man still talks about that job you did for him on the old Tecumseh. Maybe I can get you in to see what's happening. Yeah, I'll ask him. Tyler's first cruise after graduating from nuke school in Idaho had been with Dodge. He'd done a tricky repair job on some ancillary reactor equipment 2 weeks earlier than estimated, with a little creative effort and some back-channel procurement of spare parts. This had earned him and Dodge a flowery letter of commendation. I bet the old man would love to see you. When will you be finished down here? Maybe half an hour. You know where to find us. Have they moved Op-02? Same place. Call me when you're finished. My extension is 78730, okay? I gotta get back. Right. Tyler watched his old friend disappear down the corridor, then proceeded on his way to the men's room, wondering what the Russians were up to. Whatever it was enough to keep a 3-star admiral and his 4-striped captain working on a Friday night in Christmas season. 11 minutes 53.18 seconds, sir, the sergeant reported, pocketing both bills. The computer printout was over 200 pages of data. The cover sheet plotted a rough-looking bell curve of speed solutions, and below it was the noise prediction curve. The case-by-case solutions were printed individually on the remaining sheets. The curves were predictably messy. The speed curve showed the majority of solutions in the 10 to 12 knot range, the total range going from 7 to 18 knots. The noise curve was surprisingly low. Sergeant, that's one hell of a machine you have here. Believe it, sir, and reliable. We haven't had an electronic fault all month. Can I use a phone? Sure, take your pick, sir. Okay, Sarge. Tyler picked up the nearest phone. Oh, and dump the program. Okay. He typed in some instructions.
Moray is gone. Hope you kept a copy, sir.
Tyler nodded and dialed the phone.
Op-02A, Captain Coleman.
Johnny, this is Skip.
Great! Hey, the old man wants to see you. Come right up.
Tyler placed the printout in his briefcase and locked it. He thanked the sergeant one more time before hobbling out the door, giving the Cray-2 one last look. He'd have to get in here again. He could not find an operating elevator and had to struggle up a gently sloped ramp. 5 minutes later he found a Marine guarding the corridor.
You Commander Tyler, sir? The guard asked. Can I see some ID, please?
Tyler showed the corporal his Pentagon pass, wondering how many one-legged former submarine officers there might be.
Thank you, Commander. Please go down the corridor. You know the room, sir?
Sure, thanks, Corporal. Vice Admiral Dodge was sitting on the corner of a desk reading over some message flimsies. Dodge was a small, combative man who had made his mark commanding 3 separate boats, then pushing the Los Angeles-class attack submarines through their lengthy development program. Now he was Grand Dolphin, the senior admiral who fought all the battles with Congress.
Skip Tyler, You're looking good, laddie. Dodge gave Tyler's leg a furtive glance as he came over to take his hand. I hear you're doing a great job at the academy. It's all right, sir. They even let me scout the occasional ball game. Shame they didn't let you scout Army. Tyler hung his head theatrically. I did scout Army, sir. They were just too tough this year. You heard about their middle linebacker, didn't you? No. What about him? Dodge asked. He picked armor as his duty assignment, and they gave him an early trip to Fort Knox. Not to learn about tanks. To be a tank. Ha! Dodge laughed. Johnny says you have a bunch of new kids. Number 6 is due the end of February, Tyler said proudly. 6? You're not a Catholic or a Mormon, are you? What's with all this bird hatching? Tyler gave his former boss a wry look. He'd never understood that prejudice in the nuclear navy. It came from Rickover, who had invented the disparaging term bird hatching for fathering more than one child. What the hell was wrong with having kids? Admiral, since I'm not a nuke anymore, I have to do something on nights and weekends. Tyler arched his eyebrows lecherously. I hear the Ruskies are playing games. Dodge was instantly serious. They sure are. 58 attack boats, every nuclear boat in the Northern Fleet heading this way with a big surface group and most of their service forces tagging along. Doing what? Maybe you can tell me. Come on back to my inner sanctum. Dodge led Tyler into a room where he saw another new gadget, a projection screen that displayed the North Atlantic from the Tropic of Cancer to the polar ice pack. Hundreds of ships were represented. The merchantmen were white, with flags to identify their nationality. The Soviet ships were red, and their shapes depicted their ship type. The American and Allied ships were blue. The ocean was getting crowded. Christ! You got that one right, lad. Dodge nodded grimly. How are you cleared? Top secret and some special things, sir. I see everything we have on their hardware, and I do a lot of work with sea systems on the side. Johnny said you did the evaluation of the new Kirov they just sent out to the Pacific. And not bad, by the way. These two Alphas heading for Norfolk? Looks like it, and they're burning a lot of neutrons doing it. Dodge pointed. That one's heading to Long Island Sound as though to block the entrance to New London, and that one's heading to Boston, I think. These Victors are not far behind. They already have most of the British ports staked out. By Monday, they'll have 2 or more subs off every major port we have. I don't like the looks of this, sir. Neither do I. As you see, we're nearly 100% at sea ourselves. The interesting thing, though, what they're doing just doesn't figure. Captain Coleman came in. I see you let the prodigal son in, sir, Coleman said. Be nice to him, Johnny. I seem to remember when he was a right fair sub-driver. Anyway, at first it looked like they were going to block the SLOCs, but they went right past. What with these Alphas, they might be trying to blockade our coast. What about out west? Nothing. Nothing at all, just routine activity. That doesn't make any sense, Tyler objected. You don't ignore half the fleet. Of course, if you're going to war, you don't announce it by kicking every boat to max power either. The Russians are a funny bunch, Skip, Coleman pointed out. Admiral, if we start shooting at them... We heard 'em, Dodge said. With all the noise they're making, we have good locations on near all of them. They have to know that, too. That's the one thing that makes me believe they're not up to anything really bad. They're smart enough not to be that obvious, unless that's what they want us to think. Have they said anything? Tyler asked. Their ambassador says they've lost a boat, and since it has a bunch of big shots kids aboard, they laid on an all-hands rescue mission, for what that's worth. Tyler set his briefcase down and walked closer to the screen. I can see the pattern for a search and rescue, but why blockade our ports? He paused, thinking rapidly as his eyes scanned the top of the display. Sir, I don't see any boomers up here. They're in port, all of them, on both oceans. The last Delta tied up a few hours ago. That's funny, too, Dodge said, looking at the screen again. All of them, sir? Tyler asked as offhandedly as he could. Something had just occurred to him. The display screen showed the Bremerton in the Barents Sea, but not her supposed quarry. He waited a few seconds for an answer. Getting none, he turned to see the 2 officers observing him closely. Why do you ask, son? Dodge said quietly. In Sam Dodge, gentleness could be a red warning flag. Tyler thought this one over for a few seconds. He'd given Ryan his word. Could he phrase his answer without compromising it and still find out what he wanted? Yes, he decided.
There was an investigative side to Skip Tyler's character, and once he was on to something, his psyche compelled him to run it down. "Admiral, do they have a missile sub at sea? A brand new one?" Dodge stood very straight. Even so, he still had to look up at the younger man. When he spoke, his voice was glacial. "Exactly where did you get that information, Commander?" Tyler shook his head. "Admiral, I'm sorry, but I can't say. It's compartmented, sir. I think this is something you ought to know, and I'll try to get it to you." Dodge backed off to try a different tack. "You used to work for me, Skip." The Admiral was unhappy. He'd bent a rule to show something to his former subordinate because he knew him well and was sorry that he had not received the command he had worked so hard for. Tyler was technically a civilian, even though his suits were still navy blue. What made it really bad was that he knew something himself. Dodge had given him some information, and Tyler wasn't giving any back. "Sir, I gave my word," Skip apologized. "I will try to get this to you. That's a promise, sir. May I use a phone?" "Outer office," Dodge said flatly. There were 4 telephones within sight. Tyler went out and sat at a secretary's desk. He took his notebook from a coat pocket and dialed the number on the card Ryan had left him.
Akers.
A female voice answered. "Could I speak to Dr. Ryan, please?"
Dr. Ryan is not here at the moment.
"Then give me Admiral Greer, please."
One moment, please.
James Greer? Dodge was behind him. Is that who you're working for?
This is Greer. Your name Skip Tyler?
"Yes, sir."
You have that information for me?
"Yes, sir, I do."
Where are you?
"In the Pentagon, sir."
Okay, I want you to drive right up here. You know how to find the place? The guards at the main gate will be waiting for you. Get moving, son.
Greer hung up.
You're working for the CIA?
Dodge asked. "Sir, I can't say. If you will excuse me, sir, I have some information to deliver."
Mine?
The Admiral demanded. "No, sir. I already had it when I came in here. That's the truth, Admiral, and I will try to get this back to you."
Call me, Dodge ordered. We'll be here all night.
CIA headquarters. The drive up the George Washington Parkway was easier than he expected. The decrepit old highway was crowded with shoppers, but moved along at a steady crawl. He got off at the right exit and presently found himself at the guard post for the main highway entrance to the CIA. The barrier was down.
Your name Tyler Oliver W.? The guard asked. ID, please.
Tyler handed him his Pentagon pass.
Okay, Commander. Pull your car right to the main entrance. Somebody will be there to meet you.
It was another 2 minutes to the main entrance, through mostly empty parking lots glazed with ice from yesterday's melted snow. The armed guard who was waiting for him tried to help him out of the car. Tyler didn't like to be helped. He shrugged him off. Another man was waiting for him under the canopied main entrance. They were waved right through to the elevator. He found Admiral Greer sitting in front of his office fireplace, seemingly half asleep. Skip didn't know that the DDI had only returned from England a few hours earlier. The Admiral came to and ordered his plainclothes security officer to withdraw.
You must be Skip Tyler. Come on over and sit down.
That's quite a fire you have going there, sir.
I shouldn't bother. Looking at a fire makes me go to sleep. Of course, I could use a little sleep right now.
So, what do you have for me? May I ask where Jack is?
You may ask. He's away.
Oh. Tyler unlocked his briefcase and removed the printout. Sir, I ran the performance model for this Russian sub. May I ask her name? Greer chuckled.
Okay, you've earned that much. Her name is Red October. You'll have to excuse me, son. I've had a busy couple of days, and being tired makes me forget my manners.
Jack says you're pretty sharp. So does your personnel file. Now, you tell me. What'll she do? Well, Admiral, we have a wide choice of data here, and
the short version, Commander, I don't play with computers. I have people who do that for me.
From 7 to 18 knots, the best bet is 10 to 12. With that speed range, you can figure a radiated noise level about the same as that of a Yankee doing 6 knots. But you'd have to factor reactor plant noise into that also. Moreover, the character of the noise will be different from what we're used to. These multiple impeller models don't put out normal propulsion noises. They seem to generate an irregular harmonic rumble. Did Jack tell you about this? It results from a back-pressure wave in the tunnels. This fights the water flow, and that makes the rumble. Evidently, there's no way around it. Our guys spent 2 years trying to find one. What they got was a new principle of hydrodynamics. The water almost acts like air in a jet engine at idle or low speed, except that water doesn't compress like air does. So, our guys will be able to detect something, but it will be different. They're going to have to get used to a wholly new acoustical signature. Add to that the lower signal intensity, and you have a boat that will be harder to detect than anything they have at this time.
So that's what all this says.
Greer riffled through the pages. Yes, sir. You'll want to have your own people look through it. The model, the program that is, could stand a little improvement. I didn't have much time. Jack said you wanted this in a hurry. May I ask a question, sir?
You can try.
Greer leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Is, Red October at sea? That's it, isn't it? They're trying to locate her right now, Tyler asked innocently.
Something like that. We couldn't figure what these doors meant. Ryan said you might be able to, and I suppose he was right. You've earned your money, Commander. This data might just enable us to find her.
Admiral, I think Red October is up to something. Maybe even trying to defect to the United States. Greer's head came around.
Whatever makes you think that?
The Ruskies have a major fleet operation in progress. They have subs all over the Atlantic, and it looks like they're trying to blockade our coast. The story is a rescue job for a lost boat. Okay, but Jack shows up Monday with pictures of a new missile boat, and today I hear that all of their other missile boats have been recalled to port. Tyler smiled. That's kind of an odd set of coincidences, sir. Greer turned and stared at the fire. He had just joined the DIA when the Army and Air Force had pulled off the daring raid on the Son Tay prison camp 20 miles west of Hanoi. The raid had been a failure because the North Vietnamese had removed all of the captured pilots a few weeks before, something that aerial photographs could not determine. But everything else had gone perfectly. After penetrating hundreds of miles into hostile territory, the raiding force appeared entirely by surprise and caught many of the camp guards literally with their pants down. The Green Berets did a letter-perfect job of getting in and out. In the process, they killed several hundred enemy troops, themselves sustaining a single casualty, a broken ankle. The most impressive part of the mission, however, was its secrecy. Operation Kingpin had been rehearsed for months, and despite this, its nature and objective had not been guessed by friend or enemy until the day of the raid itself. On that day, a young Air Force captain of intelligence went into his general's office to ask if a deep penetration raid into North Vietnam had been laid on for the Son Tay prisoner of war camp. His astonished commander proceeded to grill the captain at length, only to learn that the bright young officer had seen enough disjointed bits and pieces to construct a clear picture of what was about to happen. Events like this gave security officers peptic ulcers. Red October is going to defect, isn't she? Tyler persisted. If the Admiral had had more sleep, he might have bluffed it out. As it was, his response was a mistake.
Did Ryan tell you this?
Sir, I haven't spoken with Jack since Monday. That's the truth, sir.
Then where did you get this other information?
Greer snapped. Admiral, I used to wear the blue suit. Most of my friends still do. I hear things, Tyler evaded. The whole picture dropped into place an hour ago. The Ruskies have never recalled all of their boomers at once. I know. I used to hunt them. Greer sighed.
Jack thinks the same as you. He's out with the fleet right now. Commander, if you tell that to anyone, I'll have your other leg mounted over top that fireplace. You understand me?
Aye, aye, sir. What are we going to do with her? Tyler smiled to himself, thinking that as a senior consultant to Sea Systems Command, he'd sure as hell get a chance to look at a for-real Russian submarine.
Give her back. After we've had a chance to look her over, of course. But there's a lot of things that could happen to prevent our ever seeing her.
It took Skip a moment to grasp what he'd just been told. Give her back? Why, for Christ's sake?
Commander, just how likely do you think this scenario is? Do you think the whole crew of a submarine has decided to come over to us all at once?
Greer shook his head.
Smart money is that it's only the officers, maybe not all of them, and that they're trying to get over here without the crews knowing what they're up to.
Oh, Tyler considered that. I suppose that does make sense. But why give her back? This isn't Japan. If somebody landed a MiG-25 here, we wouldn't give it back.
This is not like holding onto a stray fighter plane. The boat is worth $1 billion, more if you throw in the missiles and warheads. And legally, the president says, it's their property. So if they find out we have her, they'll ask for her back, and we'll have to give her back. Okay, how will they know we have her? Those crew members who don't want to defect will ask to go home. Whoever asks, we send.
You know, sir, that whoever does want to go back will be in a whole shitload of trouble. Excuse me, sir.
A shitload and a half.
Tyler hadn't known that Greer was a Mustang and could swear like a real sailor.
Some will want to stay, but most won't. They have families. Next, you'll ask me if we might arrange for the crew to disappear.
The thought has occurred to me, Tyler said.
It's occurred to us, too, but we won't. Murder 100 men? Even if we wanted to, there's no way we could conceal it in this day and age. Hell, I doubt even the Soviets could. Besides that, this simply is not the sort of thing you do in peacetime. That's one difference between us and them. You can take those reasons in any order you want.
So, except for the crew, we'd keep her?
Yes, if we could hide her. And if a pig had wings, it could fly.
Lots of places to hide her, Admiral. I can think of a few right here on the Chesapeake. And if we could get her round the Horn, there's a million little atolls we could use, and they all belong to us.
But the crew will know, and when we send them home, they'll tell their bosses,
Greer explained patiently.
and Moscow will ask for her back. Oh, sure, we'll have a week or so to conduct, safety and quarantine inspections to make sure they weren't trying to smuggle cocaine into the country.
The Admiral laughed.
A British admiral suggested we invoke the old slave-trading treaty. Somebody did that back in World War II to put the grab on a German blockade runner right before we got into it. So we'll get a ton of intelligence regardless.
Better to keep her and run her and take her apart, Tyler said quietly, staring into the orange-white flames on the oak logs. How do we keep her? He wondered. An idea began to rattle around in his head. Admiral, what if we could get the crew off without them knowing that we have the submarine?
Your full name is Oliver Wendell Tyler? Well, son, if you were named after Harry Houdini instead of a justice of the Supreme Court,
Greer looked into the engineer's face.
What do you have in mind?
While Tyler explained, Greer listened intently. To do this, sir, we'll have to get the Navy in on it right quick. Specifically, we'll need the cooperation of Admiral Dodge, and if my speed figures for this boat are anything like accurate, we'll have to move smartly. Greer rose and walked around the couch a few times to get his circulation going.
Interesting. The timing would be almost impossible, though.
I didn't say it would be easy, sir, just that we could do it.
Call home, Tyler. Tell your wife you won't be making it home. If I don't get any sleep tonight, neither do you. There's coffee behind my desk. First I have to call the judge, then we'll talk to Sam Dodge.
The USS Pogey.
Pogey, this is Black Gull 4. We are getting low on fuel. Have to return to the barn.
The Orion's tactical coordinator reported, stretching after 10 hours at his control console.
Anything you want us to get you? Over.
Yeah, I have a couple of cases of beer sent out,
Commander Wood replied. It was the current joke between P-3C and submarine crews.
Thanks for the data. We'll take it from here. Out.
Overhead, the Lockheed Orion increased power and turned southwest. The crewmen aboard would each hoist an extra beer or two at dinner, saying it was for their friends on the submarine.
Mr. Dyson, take her to 200 feet, 1/3 speed.
The officer of the deck gave the proper orders as Commander Wood moved over to the plot. The USS Pogey was 300 miles northeast of Norfolk, awaiting the arrival of two Soviet Alpha-class submarines which several relays of anti-submarine patrol aircraft had tracked all the way from Iceland. The Pogey was named for a distinguished World War II fleet submarine, named in turn for an undistinguished game fish. She had been at sea for 18 hours and was fresh from an extended overhaul at the Newport News shipyard. Nearly everything aboard was either straight from manufacturer's crates or had been completely worked over by the skilled shipfitters on the James River. This was not to say that everything worked properly. Many items had failed in one way or another on a post-overhaul shakedown the previous week, a fact less unusual than lamentable, Commander Wood thought. The Pogey's crew was new, too. Wood was on his first deployment as a commanding officer after a year of desk duty in Washington, and too many of the enlisted men were green, just out of sub-school at New London, still getting accustomed to their first cruise on a submarine. It takes time for men used to blue skies and fresh air to learn the regime inside a 32-foot diameter steel pipe. Even the experienced men were making adjustments to their new boat and officers. The Pogey had met her top speed of 33 knots on post-overhaul trials. This was fast for a ship, but slower than the speed of the Alphas she was listening to. Like all American submarines, her long suit was stealth. The Alphas had no way of knowing she was there and that they would be easy targets for her weapons, the more so since the patrolling Orion had fed the Pogey exact range information, something that ordinarily takes time to deduce from a passive sonar plot. Lieutenant Commander Tom Reynolds, the executive officer and fire control coordinator, stood casually over the tactical plot. 36 miles to the near one and 40 on the far one. On the display, they were labeled Pogey Bait 1 and 2. Everyone found the use of this service epithet amusing. "Speed 42?" Wood asked. "Yes, Captain." Reynolds had handled the radio exchange until Black Gull 4 had announced its intention to return to base. "They're driving those boats for all they're worth, right for us. We have hard solutions on both." Zap. "What do you suppose they're up to?" "The word from Sinclair is that their ambassador says they're on a SAR mission for a lost boat." His voice indicated what he thought of that. "Search and rescue, eh?" Reynolds shrugged. "Well, maybe they think they lost a boat off Point Comfort, because if they don't slow down real fast, that's where they'll end up. I never heard of Alphas operating this close to our coast. Have you, sir?" "Nope," Wood frowned. The thing about the Alphas was that they were fast and noisy. Soviet tactical doctrine seemed to call for them mainly in defensive roles. As interceptor submarines, they could protect their own missile subs, and with their high speed they could engage American attack submarines, then evade counterattack. Wood didn't think the doctrine was sound, but that was all right with him. "Maybe they want to blockade Norfolk," Reynolds suggested. "You might have a point there," Wood said. "Well, in any case, we'll just sit tight and let them burn right past us. They'll have to slow as they cross the continental shelf line, and we'll tag along behind them, nice and quiet." "Aye," Reynolds said. If they had to shoot, both men reflected, they'd find out just how tough the Alpha really was. There had been much talk about the strength of the titanium used for her hull, whether it really would withstand the force of several 100 pounds of high explosive in direct contact. A new shaped charge warhead for the Mark 48 torpedo had been developed for just this purpose, and for handling the equally tough Typhoon hull. Both officers set this thought aside. Their assigned mission was to track and shadow. The E.S. Polatovsky. Pogey Bait 2 was known to the Soviet Navy as the E.S. Polatovsky. This Alpha-class attack sub was named for the chief engineering officer of the Russian fleet, who had sailed all the way around the world to meet his appointment with destiny in the Tsushima Straits. Evgeny Sigismundovich Polatovsky had served the Tsar's navy with skill and a devotion to duty equal to that of any officer in history. But in his diary, which was discovered years later in Leningrad, the brilliant officer had decried in the most violent terms the corruption and excesses of the Tsarist regime, giving a grim counterpoint to the selfless patriotism he had shown as he sailed knowingly to his death. This made him a genuine hero for Soviet seamen to emulate, and the state had named its greatest engineering achievement in his memory. Unfortunately, the Polatovsky had enjoyed no better luck than he had enjoyed in the face of Togo's guns. The Polatovsky's acoustical signature was labeled Alpha 3 by the Americans. This was incorrect. She had been the first of the Alphas. The small, spindle-shaped attack submarine had reached 43 knots 3 hours into her initial builder's trials. Those trials had been cut short only a minute later by an incredible mishap. A 50-ton right whale had somehow blundered in her path, and the Polatovsky had rammed the unfortunate creature broadside. The impact had smashed 10 square meters of bow plating, annihilated the sonar dome, knocked a torpedo tube askew, and nearly flooded the torpedo room. This did not count shock damage to nearly every interior system from electronic equipment to the galley stove, and it was said that if anyone but the famous Vilnius headmaster had been in command, the submarine would surely have been lost. A 2-meter segment of the whale's rib was now a permanent fixture at the Officers' Club in Severomorsk, dramatic testament to the strength of Soviet submarines. In fact, the damage had taken over a year to repair, and by the time the Polatovsky sailed again, there were already 2 other Alphas in service. 2 days after sailing on her next shakedown, she suffered another major casualty, the total failure of her high-pressure turbine. This had taken 6 months to replace. There had been 3 more minor incidents since, and the submarine was forever marked as a bad luck ship. Chief Engineer Vladimir Pechakokov was a loyal party member and a committed atheist, but he was also a sailor and therefore profoundly superstitious. In the old days, his ship would have been blessed on launching, and thereafter every time she sailed. It would have been an impressive ceremony, with a bearded priest, clouds of incense, and evocative hymns. He had sailed without any of that, and found himself wishing otherwise. He needed some luck. Pechakokov was having trouble with his reactor. The Alpha reactor plant was small. It had to fit into a relatively small hull. It was also powerful for its size, and this one had been running at 100% rated power for just over 4 days. They were racing for the American post at 42.3 knots, as fast as the 8-year-old plant would permit. The Polatovsky was due for a comprehensive overhaul. New sonar, new computers, and a redesigned reactor control suite were all planned for the coming months. Petchakokov thought it was irresponsible, reckless, to push his submarine so hard, even if everything were functioning properly. No alpha plant on a submarine had ever been pushed this hard, not even a new one. And on this one, things were beginning to come apart. The primary high-pressure reactor coolant pump was beginning to vibrate ominously. This was particularly worrying to the engineer. There was a backup, but the secondary pump had a lower rated power, and using it meant losing 8 knots of speed. The alpha plant achieved its high power not with a sodium-cooled system, as the Americans thought, but by running at a far higher pressure than any reactor system afloat and using a revolutionary heat exchange system that boosted the plant's overall thermal efficiency to 41%, well in excess of that for any other submarine. But the price of this was a reactor that at full power was red-lined on every monitor gauge, and in this case the red lines were not mere symbolism, they signified genuine danger. This fact, added to the vibrating pump, had Petchakokov seriously concerned. An hour earlier he had pleaded with the captain to reduce power for a few hours so that his skilled crew of engineers could make repairs. It was probably only a bad bearing after all, and they had spares. The pump had been designed so that it would be easy to fix. The captain had wavered, wanting to grant the request, but the political officer had intervened, pointing out that their orders were both urgent and explicit. They had to be on station as quickly as possible. To do otherwise would be politically unsound. And that was that. Petchakokov bitterly remembered the look in his captain's eyes. What was the purpose of a commanding officer if his every order had to be approved by a political flunky? Petchakokov had been a faithful communist since joining the Octobrists as a boy. But damn it! What was the point of having specialists and engineers? Did the party really think that physical laws could be overturned by the whim of some apparatchik with a heavy desk and a dasha in the Moscow suburbs? The engineer swore to himself. He stood alone at the master control board. This was located in the engine room, aft of the compartment that held the reactor and the heat exchanger steam generator, the latter placed right at the submarine's center of gravity. The reactor was pressurized to 20 kilograms per square centimeter, about 2,800 pounds per square inch. Only a fraction of this pressure came from the pump. The higher pressure caused a higher boiling point for the coolant. In this case, the water was heated to over 900 degrees Celsius, a temperature sufficient to generate steam which gathered at the top of the reactor vessel. The steam bubble applied pressure to the water beneath, preventing the generation of more steam. The steam and water regulated one another in a delicate balance. The water was dangerously radioactive as a result of the fission reaction taking place within the uranium fuel rods. The function of the control rods was to regulate the reaction. Again, the control was delicate. At most, the rods could absorb just less than 1% of the neutron flux, but this was enough either to permit the reaction or to prevent it. Petchakokov could recite all this data in his sleep. He could draw a wholly accurate schematic diagram of the entire engine plant from memory and could instantly grasp the significance of the slightest change in his instrument readings. He stood perfectly straight over the control board, his eyes tracing the myriad dials and gauges in a regular pattern, one hand poised over the scram switch, the other over the emergency cooling controls. He could hear the vibration. It had to be a bad bearing getting worse as it wore more and more unevenly. If the crankshaft bearings went bad, the pump would seize, and they'd have to stop. This would be an emergency, though not really a dangerous one. It would mean that repairing the pump, if they could repair it at all, would take days instead of hours, eating up valuable time and spare parts. That was bad enough. What was worse, and what Petchakokov did not know, was that the vibration was generating pressure waves in the coolant. To make use of the newly developed heat exchanger, the alpha plant had to move water rapidly through its many loops and baffles. This required a high-pressure pump, which accounted for 150 pounds of the total system pressure, almost 10 times what was considered safe in Western reactors. With the pump so powerful, the whole engine room complex, normally very noisy at high speed, was like a boiler factory, and the pump's vibration was disturbing the performance of the monitor instruments. It was making the needles on his gauges waver, Petchakokov noted. He was right and wrong. The pressure gauges were really wavering because of the 30-pound overpressure waves pulsing through the system. The chief engineer did not recognize this for what it was. He had been on duty too many hours. Within the reactor vessel, these pressure waves were approaching the frequency at which a piece of equipment resonated. Roughly halfway down the interior surface of the vessel was a titanium fitting, part of the backup cooling system. In the event of a coolant loss and after a successful scram, valves inside and outside the vessel would open, cooling the reactor either with a mixture of water and barium or, as a last measure, with seawater which could be vented in and out of the vessel, at the cost of ruining the entire reactor. This had been done once, and though it had been costly, the action of a junior engineer had prevented the loss of a Victor-class attack sub by catastrophic meltdown. Today, the inside valve was closed, along with the corresponding through-hull fitting. The valves were made of titanium because they had to function reliably after prolonged exposure to high temperature, and also because titanium was very corrosion-resistant. High-temperature water was murderously corrosive. What had not been fully considered was that the metal was also exposed to intense nuclear radiation, and this particular titanium alloy was not completely stable under extended neutron bombardment. The metal had become brittle over the years. The minute waves of hydraulic pressure were beating against the clapper in the valve. As the pump's frequency of vibration changed, it began to approach the frequency at which the clapper vibrated. This caused the clapper to snap harder and harder against its retaining ring. The metal at its edges began to crack. A mitchman at the forward end of the compartment heard it first, a low buzz coming through the bulkhead. At first he thought it was feedback noise from the PA speaker, and he waited too long to check it. The clapper broke free and dropped out of the valve nozzle. It was not very large, only 10 centimeters in diameter and 5 millimeters thick. This type of fitting is called a butterfly valve, and the clapper looked just like a butterfly, suspended and twirling in the water flow. If it had been made of stainless steel, it would have been heavy enough to fall to the bottom of the vessel. But it was made of titanium, which was both stronger than steel and very much lighter. The coolant flow moved it up towards the exhaust pipe. The outward-moving water carried the clapper into the pipe, which had a 15-centimeter inside diameter. The pipe was made of stainless steel, 2-meter sections welded together for easy replacement in the cramped quarters. The clapper was borne along rapidly towards the heat exchanger. Here the pipe took a 45-degree downward turn, and the clapper jammed momentarily. This blocked half of the pipe's channel, and before the surge of pressure could dislodge the clapper, too many things happened. The moving water had its own momentum. On being blocked, it generated a back pressure wave within the pipe. Total pressure jumped momentarily to 3,400 pounds. This caused the pipe to flex a few millimeters. The increased pressure, lateral displacement of a weld joint, and cumulative effect of years of high-temperature erosion of the steel damaged the joint. A hole the size of a pencil point opened. The escaping water flashed instantly into steam, setting off alarms in the reactor compartment and neighboring spaces. It ate at the remainder of the weld, rapidly expanding the failure until reactor coolant was erupting as though from a horizontal fountain. One jet of steam demolished the adjacent reactor control wiring conduits. What had just begun was a catastrophic loss of coolant accident. The reactor was fully depressurized within 3 seconds. Its many gallons of coolant exploded into steam, seeking release into the surrounding compartment. A dozen alarms sounded at once on the master control board, and in the blink of an eye Vladimir Petchakokov faced his ultimate nightmare. The engineer's automatic trained reaction was to jam his finger on the scram switch, but the steam in the reactor vessel had disabled the rod control system, and there wasn't time to solve the problem. In an instant, Petchakokov knew that his ship was doomed. Next, he opened the emergency coolant controls, admitting seawater into the reactor vessel. This automatically set off alarms throughout the hull. In the control room forward, the captain grasped the nature of the emergency at once. The Polatovsky was running at 150 meters. He had to get her to the surface immediately, and he shouted orders to blow all ballast and make full rise on the diving planes. The reactor emergency was regulated by physical laws. With no reactor coolant to absorb the heat of the uranium rods, the nuclear reaction actually stopped. There was no water to attenuate the neutron flux. This was no solution, however, since the residual decay heat was sufficient to melt everything in the compartment. The cold water admitted into the vessel drew off the heat but also slowed down too many neutrons, keeping them in the reactor core. This caused a runaway reaction that generated even more heat, more than any amount of coolant could control. What had started as a loss of coolant accident became something worse, a cold water accident. It was now only a matter of minutes before the entire core melted, and the Polatovsky had that long to get to the surface. Petchakokov stayed at his post in the engine room doing what he could. His own life, he knew, was almost certainly lost. He had to give his captain time to surface the boat. There was a drill for this sort of emergency, and he barked orders to implement it. It only made things worse. His duty electrician moved along the electrical control panels, switching from main power to emergency, since residual steam power in the turbo alternators would die in a few more seconds. In a moment, the submarine's power completely depended on standby batteries. In the control room, power was lost to the electrically controlled trim tabs on the trailing edge of the diving planes, which automatically switched back to electro-hydraulic control. This powered not just the small trim tabs, but the diving planes as well. The control assemblies moved instantly to a 15-degree up angle, and she was still moving at 39 knots. With all her ballast tanks now blasted free of water by compressed air, the submarine was very light, and she rose like a climbing aircraft. In seconds, the astonished control room crew felt their boat rise to an up angle that was 45 degrees and getting worse. A moment later, they were too busy trying to stand to come to grips with the problem. Now the Alpha was climbing almost vertically at 30 miles per hour. Every man and unsecured item aboard fell sternward. In the motor control room aft, a crewman crashed against the main electrical switchboard, short-circuiting it with his body, and all power aboard was lost. A cook who had been inventorying survival gear in the torpedo room forward struggled into the escape trunk as he fought his way into an exposure suit. Even with only a year's experience, he was quick to understand the meaning of the hooting alarms and unprecedented actions of his boat. He yanked the hatch shut and began to work the escape controls as he had been taught in submarine school. The Politovsky soared through the surface of the Atlantic like a broaching whale, coming 3/4 of her length out of the water before crashing back. The USS Poggy. Con, sonar.
Con, aye, Captain speaking.
Skipper, you better hear this. Something just went crazy on Bait 2, Poggy's chief reported. Wood was in the sonar room in seconds, putting on earphones plugged into a tape recorder which had a 2-minute offset. Commander Wood heard a whooshing sound. The engine noises stopped. A few seconds later there was an explosion of compressed air and a staccato of hull-popping noises as the submarine changed depth rapidly. "What's going on?" Wood asked quickly. The E.S. Politovsky. In the Politovsky's reactor, the runaway fission reaction had virtually annihilated both the incoming seawater and the uranium fuel rods. Their debris settled on the after wall of the reactor vessel. In a minute there was a meter-wide puddle of radioactive slag, enough to form its own critical mass. The reaction continued, unabated, this time directly attacking the tough stainless steel of the vessel. Nothing man-made could long withstand 5,000 degrees of direct heat. In 10 seconds the vessel wall failed. The uranium mass dropped free against the aft bulkhead. Petchakokov knew he was dead. He saw the paint on the forward bulkhead turn black, and his last impression was of a dark mass surrounded with a blue glow. The engineer's body vaporized an instant later, and the mass of slag dropped to the next bulkhead aft. Forward, the submarine's nearly vertical angle in the water eased. The high-pressure air in the ballast tanks spilled out of the bottom floods, and the tanks filled with water, dropping the angle of the boat and submerging her. In the forward part of the submarine, men were screaming. The captain struggled to his feet, ignoring his broken leg, trying to get control, to get his men organized and out of the submarine before it was too late. But the luck of Evgeny Sigismundovich Politovsky would plague his namesake one last time. Only one man escaped. The cook opened the escape trunk hatch and got out. Following what he had learned during the drill, he began to seal the hatch so that men behind him could use it, but a wave slapped him off the hull as the sub slid backwards. In the engine room, the changing angle dropped the melted core to the deck. The hot mass attacked the steel deck first, burning through that, then the titanium of the hull. 5 seconds later the engine room was vented to the sea. The Politovsky's largest compartment filled rapidly with water. This destroyed what little reserve buoyancy the ship had, and the acute down angle returned. The Alpha began her last dive. The stern dropped just as the captain began to get his control room crew to react to orders again. His head struck an instrument console. What slim hopes his crew had died with him. The Politovsky was falling backwards, her propeller windmilling the wrong way as she slid to the bottom of the sea. The Poggy. "Skipper, I was on the chopper back in '69, the Poggy's chief said, referring to a horrifying accident on a diesel-powered submarine. "That's what it sounds like," his captain said. He was now listening to direct sonar input. There was no mistaking it. The submarine was flooding. They had heard the ballast tanks refill. This could only mean interior compartments were filling with water. If they had been closer, they might have heard the screams of men in that doomed hull. Wood was just as happy he couldn't. The continuing rush of water was dreadful enough. Men were dying. Russians, his enemy, but men not unlike himself, and there was not a thing that could be done about it. Bait 1, he saw, was proceeding, unmindful of what had happened to her trailing sister. The E.S. Politovsky. It took 9 minutes for the Politovsky to fall the 2,000 feet to the ocean floor. She impacted savagely on the hard sand bottom at the edge of the continental shelf. It was a tribute to her builders that her interior bulkheads held. All the compartments from the reactor room aft were flooded and half the crew killed in them, but the forward compartments were dry. Even this was more curse than blessing. With the aft air storage banks unusable and only emergency battery power to run the complex environmental control systems, the 40 men had only a limited supply of air. They were spared a rapid death from the crushing North Atlantic, only to face a slower one from asphyxiation.